so disturbing to think back to that time and the failure. I mean, there was a great piece by, it's completely, I mean, it makes total sense when you begin to think about it. Remember That Time by Jamel Bowie, who writes at Slate, recalling Hurricane Katrina, and it's entitled Where Black Lives Matter Began. And there was just an incredible sense, and an inescapable sense, in watching this whole thing unfold, that the country just did not, and by the country, I mean really the sort of the institutions and the apparatus that is supposed to deal with these type of things, did not care about these black people who were stuck in New Orleans. And you'll recall there was I can't remember for the life of me how much longer it was. Maybe it was a month, maybe it was weeks or 2 months. I think it was a bit of a marathon on NBC. I think it was NBC, where they were raising money for Katrina victims. And Kanye West went on, I think he was on with Mike Myers, and basically said, George Bush doesn't care about black people. And I mean, I think that was true. I think that was true to a large degree, frankly. But, one never knows what's in someone's heart. But what was clear is that there was a massive failure of the Republican ideology, where FEMA had been privatized to the point where they could not prepare for something like this, and they could not rebuild in an efficient way because of the enormous amount of subcontracting that had to go on. When you strip these apparatus you save in the short run. And it was sort of like what I think Bloomberg learned with the snowplows at one point. There was all sorts of privatization of the snowplows. They basically said to the sanitation department, "We're not going to pay for as many snowplows from you, and we will just make it up on an ad hoc basis." Well, of course, when you do that, those guys who own their own snowplows are going out and doing other jobs. So if you wait, they're not going to be there. So it's either you pay to make sure that they're available in the event of an emergency, or you save a couple of bucks in the short run and risk a major disaster. And that's exactly what was done with FEMA. It was run really with the same sort of perspective that, I don't know, what was it, Independence or Freedom Industries had, where they are going to, Freedom Industries was the factory that stored the chemicals in West Virginia, I think it was. And they basically say, like, look, we can pay extra to make sure that our facility is top-notch and can never have a problem, or we can basically offload that risk onto the population in general, save ourselves the money, and if that 1 in 10, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 500,000 event happens, somebody else will deal with the cost, essentially. And that's basically the attitude that FEMA was, when Michael Brown was brought in, was to basically privatize it, cut down on its services, and just, when you need it, you hire the private businesses to do it. And of course, that risk is not only passed on to the public in general, but that risk is actually that much more great for those who don't have money. Right? Because that risk becomes much greater for you in New Orleans if you don't have the money to own a car. If you don't have the money to go and take a couple of days at a hotel or motel up the road because it's not going to break the bank for you, or you actually have the cash. I mean, the reality is, for some people, the idea of like, I'm going to weigh this risk. Stay here, go spend what amounts to maybe half a week's pay, maybe a day's pay, maybe a week's pay to go stay at a motel for a couple of days. If it turns out there's no storm, there's no storm. But for a huge number of people living in that city, I can't afford to pay a month's income on the chance that this may actually happen. Or I don't even have 3 nights worth of staying at a motel. Or I don't even have the ability to get to that motel. So that risk that is offloaded by FEMA because it's been privatized, or the risk that is offloaded by Freedom Industries, or really any of these corporations that do this type of thing. It's not just offloaded to the public at large. It is exponentially more assumed, that risk, by people who have less money. So they're assuming the risk of like, well, I may end up in the Superdome with 20,000 other people and virtually no food, no plumbing, no electricity. I remember the people standing out there with signs saying, we're dying. And over 1,000 did. And so now we have this city being rebuilt. And Gary Rivlin had a mole, essentially, that it was involved in a lot of these sort of plannings, named Lance Hill. And I have the quote that gets a lot of attention from Lance Hill, which was basically like, oh, they're using this to rebuild the city as a white city. A white, wealthy city. And that's basically what they've done. And, as far as I know, and I don't know how one would even go about it, but I don't know that we have any comprehensive sense of what happened to those 100,000 people. I mean, yes, some moved to another city. They just stayed because they didn't have the money to come back. I imagine that was a lot of them, but I wonder how many of those dispossessed people, we're talking about 100,000 people who leave with basically nothing. I think it was one of the Bushes, actually. Maybe it was Barbara Bush walking through the Houston Astrodome, looking at about 10,000 people, saying something like, oh, they're so fortunate to be getting
better
food.
off.
Better off.
Everyone is so overwhelmed by the hospitality.
And we have no sense of how people integrated into these new communities, how many children were essentially, lost, just lost. They lose a year or two of school. I mean, who knows? Who knows? And I remember George Bush standing in front of, I don't know what building it was, some iconic New Orleans building, well lit, so well lit that it looked like he was in a studio in front of a green screen, and saying, I promise you, we will not abandon New Orleans. Yet 10 years later, I think they're now officially saying the recovery is over. But they're still the Ninth Ward. And I think it was at Lakeview, which was a very sort of high-end part of New Orleans, is actually below sea level. And the Ninth Ward itself, the lower Ninth Ward, no. So one of those situations which became a self-fulfilling prophecy, sort of fascinating how a rumor becomes reality, and then all of a sudden this place gets abandoned. But I encourage you all to read the book. I was trying to think if, how often it is that you remember the name so vividly of a storm. And I imagine if you live in a locale that's hit by a hurricane or a tornado, you remember it. I mean, my folks still talk about a tornado that came through Worcester in 1951 or 52, I think it was. But I haven't set foot in New Orleans in 25 years. More. But that Katrina stuff still resonates with me. It's really, really unbelievable. And I think it did. I think it really did. I only could imagine if we had the type of social media then that we have now, as to just the sort of the level of awareness of what was going on. It would have been just horrid. And maybe, these type of things, I mean, that is, maybe it would have changed the nature of the response or the nature of the rebuilding too.